Good morning. My name's Carl Brown, and I'm one of the ministers at North Highlands Baptist Church. Welcome to my home. We are here for another backyard Bible study. So thank you for joining us, and let's get into the Word. So this week we are covering the second half of the book of Numbers. We're making our way through the Pentateuch, through the 5 books of law. Last week we got to this horrible point where the Israelites have finally pushed it too far in their rejection of God, and they're whining and they're complaining, and God is punishing them now by telling them that they're going to live in the desert for 40 years and not go into the promised land. That it's their children that will inherit the promised land instead of them, because they've chosen that over God, and they don't want to go in and conquer it. And so now these 2 to 3 million of people are moving away from the land of Canaan, away from the promised land in the land of milk and honey, and they're going to wander around the desert for 40 years. That's a long time for a caravan of that many people. But that's exactly what they're going to do. But they haven't learned their lesson, and that's what we'll see today about complaining and about gratitude and about following God's leaders. So there are 3 leaders in chapter 16 that you need to know about. Their names are Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and the ringleader is Korah, are challenging the leadership of Moses and Aaron, and they want to take over leadership, and they have quite a following, and they want to go back to Egypt or do something else. They just don't want to follow Moses' leadership. Now, I think Moses is getting tired of all this nonsense, and he's already, he's an older man, and he's already put up with it a lot, and he's been very humble about it. He was even humble in this situation. And he put it before God. God, you want him to lead, then let him lead. But I think he's getting kind of fed up with always doing this. And maybe because he didn't get to go into Canaan, and he was ready to conquest and ready to have some rest. And I don't know. This is what Moses says, how he says it. He says in verse 29 and 16, if these men die naturally like all men, if they are visited by a common fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. He says, but if the Lord creates a new thing, and the earth opens up its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, they will go down alive into the pit. Then you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord. Wow, that's almost like Elijah calling fire down from heaven. Moses said, if these guys die naturally, you're right, I was not sent by God. Before he's finished speaking these words, the ground begins to rumble, and everybody starts shouting, get away from these guys' tents, run for your lives. You can imagine it. And the earth does, it opens up and swallows Korah and all that he owns, and his entire family line, and Dathan and Abiram, and they're gone, and then it closes up on top of them, and everybody around that was close to them. And so, wow. And then that's not enough for Israelites. Again, they're grumbling, and they're saying to Moses and Aaron, you killed God's people. What are y'all doing? You did it. It's because you said that God did that, so you've killed God's people. And God got angry and judged them, and they had a plague go through the land, and Aaron and Moses had to pray and intercede to God for it to stop. That's back up to chapter 17. So here we are in chapter 17. God says, enough is enough on questioning who's leading these people, and whether or not the Levites are my leaders there, and specifically Aaron and Moses are leaders there. He says, we're going to take care of this. And that's when we get to chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, speak to the children of Israel and get them a rod from each father's house, all their leaders according to their father's houses, 12 rods. Write each man's name on his rod, and you shall write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi. For there shall be one rod for the head of each father's house. So they got rods. Basically, they got their staffs. All right. Well, he has them put them all in the tabernacle. And And when they put them all in the tabernacle, he says in verse 5, he says, "And it shall be that the rod of the man whom I choose will blossom. Thus I will rid myself of the complaints of the children of Israel, which they make against you." God's tired of hearing these complaints. He says, so I'm going to make one of these rods blossom, bloom. One of these dead pieces of wood is going to bloom. Then the next day when they came in, Moses went into a tabernacle, verse 8, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms and yielded ripe almonds. It takes a long time for an almond to come ripe, but it had yielded ripe almonds all in one night. Brings it out, everybody sees it, and they are in fear. They understand that Aaron is now, the Levites are the leaders, and they're going to follow these leaders. Moses and Aaron are their leaders, and they shut up about that. And they are so scared that they actually say in verse 12, we will die. Oh, we're going to die. Oh, no, we're all going to die again. We've sinned and we're going to die. And they're just scared to death they're going to die for good reason. So here's a little interesting point of trivia. What are the three things, the reminders that God has put into the Ark of the Covenant, that are in the Ark of the Covenant, that are reminders not only to the people of Israel, but reminder to God of his promises to the people of Israel? What are the three things that are in the Ark? Now, I know many of you probably saw Raiders of the Lost Ark like I did, and so you open the Ark and everyone's faces melt. That's not exactly how it is, or we don't think it is. But we do know that there are three things that are in the Ark of the Covenant, and we've covered them all now in our Bible study. First thing they have is a golden pot of manna, and that manna would rot usually in a day, but not this pot of manna was preserved. And so it's in there to remind the people that God is their provider and sustainer. So that's a good reminder there. The second one is the tablets of law that God wrote on. So the Ten Commandments are in the Ark of the Covenant to remind the people that God is the one who gives order and makes the law. And then the third is this, the rod of Aaron. The rod of Aaron is put in there to remind the people that God is the one who chooses the leader and leads the people. So those are the three things, the three reminders that are in the Ark of the Covenant. So, good. God chose a leader. So what do we learn from this? God puts leaders over us, and we need to respect that in church, at work, in our country, in our nation, in the world. God is sovereign, and the leaders that are put over us, we need to respect and know that God is sovereign over that, and we need to submit to that. Talks about that more in the Bible later, but especially here, it talks about how God has chosen these people to lead, and the Israelites need to follow them, and they need to respect them as their leaders. And this is true for us as Christians. We need to respect and follow our spiritual leaders, but we also need to respect and follow all leaders that God puts over us. We are now in chapter 20, and we're going to see the great sin of Moses and Aaron that kept them from going into the promised land. All right, a normal complaint. In chapter 20, verses 2 through 5, we see they wandered to an area where there was no water. And they said, now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, if only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. And it just, the same thing. Why have you brought us here all to die, and for all of our cattle to die? And can't we just, it would have been better if we just died earlier or died in Egypt? Why are you punishing us, making us going around like this? So we have recorded here in verse 8 of chapter 20 what God said. He says, take a rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation for all the animals. So he was supposed to take his rod and Aaron, and they were supposed to speak to this rock, and then water would come out of the rock. Well, That's not what happened. Look in verse 10. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. All right, so God said, Speak to the rock, and the water will come out. Moses and Aaron kind of colluded together, but Moses did this. Moses and Aaron got up there and said, Must we, Moses and Aaron, provide water for you? Do we have to do everything for you? And then they struck the rock with the staff. Nothing happened. He struck it again. And here we talked about this last week, but here it happens again. God is faithful many times to us, even when we are faithless. God had no obligation to make water come out of that rock because Moses did not do it the way that God had asked him to. God told him to. He didn't ask him. He told him to speak to it. But instead of doing that, Moses not only struck the rock, but him and Aaron took credit for it. Said, must we do this? And then they struck it, making it look like Moses and Aaron had provided water for all the people. Unlike all the other miracles where Moses in his humility honored God and said, God is doing this for you. You need to worship God, not me. You need to make sure you give the credit to the right person. In 12, there are consequences. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me, to honor me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. So the great consequence that Moses and Aaron had is after all this time in the desert and all the time they were going to have in the desert and all the things they'd been through with the people, now they were not going to be allowed to go into the promised land because of this sin. You may think that's harsh. I may think it's harsh. Doesn't matter what we think. What matters is what God thinks. And God will be honored. God will be glorified in front of his people. Do not take his credit. And this is a sin. And God judges a sin, and his judgment is right, and his judgment is good, and his judgment is appropriate. And so God judged Moses and Aaron for what they did wrong. And what do we need to learn from this? We already learned, one, that God puts leaders over us. Now this is our lesson for the leaders today. Leaders, give God credit. Make sure you know that you are a vessel that God is using, and give him all the credit and all the glory for the things that are happening that are good in your ministry. All right, that brings us to a real interesting little story. In chapter 21 of Numbers, we have them getting closer to the way of the Red Sea. And in verse 5 it says, And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Just kind of familiar refrain happening here. Now, but this wasn't like every day. This was over the course of 40 years. Their frustration would build up and it would pour out of them. And here they go again. For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. They're complaining about the manna that God is providing for them every single day. And so I understand that they're getting tired of eating the same thing all the time. But I'm telling you, they are just so ungrateful. And it says, we just loathe this worthless bread. I mean, it's one thing to think it. It's totally another thing to say it out loud and to be so disrespectful. Verse 6, So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. I don't know what a fiery serpent is. I'm just saying, are they serpents that are on fire? Was it because their bite really felt like fire? was it the way they looked? Were they like orange or whatever? But snakes are no fun in the first place. But a fiery serpent that if it bites you, you die. Woo! That's a scary thing, man. that would stir up the camp. Just one of them. Imagine a whole bunch of fiery serpents coming into the camp and biting people and people dying. Oh no, it didn't take long for people to turn around really quick. Verse 7, it says, Then the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord, and against you pray the Lord take these serpents away from us. I mean, it was a fast turnaround this time. Snakes will do that. You'll question everything you ever believed or ever said when you see a snake is coming at you. So I just think that's very real to life. So they realized their sin real quick with these fiery serpents. And then the Lord said to Moses, Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, will live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and if the people looked at it, they would live, even if they were bitten. Didn't say they would stop biting them. Didn't say they weren't going to still be bit until they killed all the serpents. It said that if they were bit, if they looked on this pole, that they would live. So looking to God's for their salvation and believing, they had to look believing that God would provide for them. Now that's foreshadowing, not the serpent, but looking to God being raised up for salvation. That's foreshadowing, and that's an interesting little story that we have here in the Bible. A lot of people think this is the caduceus, that is the medical symbol that we see all the time, that has the snakes and maybe snakes on a pole, or snakes on a pole with two snakes on a pole with wings, and it's on the medical symbol. But that's not what that is. That is not where that comes from. It may have the same roots back in mythology. People may have heard about it, but that actually comes from Greek mythology. That is actually the rod of Asclepius, and who was a healer. And so that's why they have that as a symbol. It's a Greek symbol of healing, and it's also associated with Hermes, the god of war, and that he would carry this staff when he went into war to help heal people. And so that's not this bronze serpent that Moses created, but since this predates Greek mythology, they may have gotten something from it, but it's not the same thing. And so that brings us to the story of Balak and Balaam. Two great names, huh? And so Balak is the king of Moab, and he sees that Og has been defeated, this great king, and Arad and Sihon, and he sees the great mob of the Israelites coming his way, and he's fearful. He is scared of them. Matter of fact, it says that he is terrified. If you look in chapter 22, verse 2 and 3, it says, Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people because there were many, and Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. Balak goes to the Midianites and say, "Hey, we gotta take care of this." It says they're gonna take over the whole land. They're eating up land like a ox eats up grass. We've got to go take care of all this, and so they devise this plan to go to Balaam. Now Balaam is a prophet. There's lots of mystery around exactly who Balaam was a prophet to and what he was. There are some traditions that say that Balaam was a great advisor, and that he was a prophet to the world. He was not a Jew. He was not an Israelite, but he kind of lived up there close to the land where Abraham came from. And Balak went to Balaam to try to get Balaam to curse the Israelites where he could win in a battle against them. So we pick up in chapter 22, verse 5. It says, Then Balak sent messengers to Balaam the son of Beor at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Look, a people has come from Egypt, See, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. Therefore, please come at once to curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whom you bless is blessed, and whom you curse is cursed. Now, Balak really had a lot of belief in Balaam. And tradition holds that Balaam is the one who had prophesied that Balak would be king over the Moabites. And so he had a lot of faith in him. And so he sends and he asks them to do this thing. So here's Balaam's response in verse 8. He says to them, lodge here tonight, and I will bring back a word to you as the Lord speaks to me. And then God says to Balaam, in verse 12, you are not to go with him. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. Verse 13, so Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to give me permission to go with you. So Balaam hears from God. He knows it's God. And God says, don't go curse my people. They're blessed by me. And so Balaam says, y'all go on. I can't do this for you. All right. Good. Balaam did the right thing. Well, look in verse 15. Then Balak again sent princes more numerous and more honorable, more distinguished than the ones he had sent before. And they came to Balaam and said to him, Balak says, please let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I certainly honor you greatly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Therefore, please come, curse this people for me. Then Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, though Balak were to give me the house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God, to do less or more. That was the wisest thing Balaam ever said. He said, you fill up your house, your palace with gold, I still can't do more than what God says I can do when it comes to blessing or cursing this people. And he says, but, spend the night again, and I will talk to God and see if he has any more to say to me. Verse 20. God came to Balaam at night and said to him, if the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do. So Balaam rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. Look at verse 22. This is very interesting. Then God's anger was aroused because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him, and he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. Now, if you just look at that, it looks like God contradicted himself. It looks like God said, go ahead, go with them. And then because he went with them, he got really angry and sent his angel down to take him out. But we have to remember something here, that God doesn't change. And God's not wishy-washy in his will like that. And so I think it takes us back to seeing again, remembering that God doesn't change. What is it about Balaam and what is it about what he did from what God said that angered the Lord? And I think it's that little word that we see right there in verse 20. If the men come to call you, rise and go with them. And then we see in 21, so Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his own donkey. Balaam didn't wait for them to come and call on him. He got up early and saddled his own donkey. It says he had servants. He saddled his donkey. Balaam, what I get from this is that Balaam was eager to go. Balaam wanted to go. Balaam couldn't wait to go. I think Balaam wanted that money and that pride. And we'll see that actually later. Later in Scripture, we'll see that attitude of greed, that attitude of pride to be called on to do this, that he really wanted to go. And I think the Lord's anger burned against him on that. Then we have one of the craziest stories in Scripture. Look in verse 23. It says, now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord. Now the donkey saw the angel, but Balaam didn't. The donkey was allowed to see the angel, but Balaam didn't. And he saw him standing in the way with his drawn sword in hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So he's going this way. He took off that direction. And so Balaam beat his donkey, struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. Just want you to know it's a girl donkey, which is just makes sense because women typically have more sense. Females have more sense than males. I'm just saying. All right, then verse 24. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards with a wall on one side and a wall on the other side. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall, trying to work her way around the angel, and it crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. And so he beat her again. Then the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either left or the right. Now the donkey's coming. Can't run into a field. Can't back up. Can't go to the left or right. Can't work its way around. And this is what the donkey does. She laid down under Balaam. So Balaam's anger was aroused, and he beat his donkey with his staff. This donkey wasn't having it. Donkey's like, I am not going through that. And Balaam didn't see the angel was beating his donkey. And I'm sure Balaam was also really embarrassed because he had all these princes with him that he was going with. And here he's got a donkey that's not even minding him. It was humiliating. But then what happened next is fantastic. Verse 28. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, what have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? So he's beating his donkey, and the donkey speaks to him, talks to him. And he's so angry, he doesn't even blink. And that would probably, it would scare me to death or something, Hey, he's speaking. And I'd probably run screaming the other direction. Not Balaam. He's so angry, he doesn't even blink. He just gets into an argument with this donkey. And Balaam said to the donkey, because you have abused me, I wish there were a sword in my hand now, for I would kill you. So the donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to act this way before? And Balaam had to say no. I think that's so funny. I think that's great. Have I ever acted this way? Am I not you've known me my whole life. I'm your donkey, man. Don't beat me. I'm your donkey. And finally Balaam gets the sense to go, no, you've never acted this way. Certainly never talked. That's new. I'm sure that's new. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes in verse 31, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And he bowed his head and fell on his face. The angel of the Lord is definitely imposing and impressive and intimidating. And the angel of the Lord says to him about the donkey, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to stand against you because your way is perverse before me. Now, again, his way is perverse. Again, it's not just disobedience. His way is perverse. That's speaking more to his intention and his attitude. Your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would have killed you by now and let her live. And Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the way against me. Now, therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back. So now Balaam has been sufficiently humiliated and humbled by the angel of the Lord, and he realizes his sin. But the angel of the Lord says in 35, says, go on with the men, but I'm telling you, only say what I want you to say. So this has really now been impressed upon Balaam that he's going to Balak, but he can only say what God tells him to say. I'm going to tell you what happens in chapter 23. Chapter 23, Balak is so happy to see Balaam, and he takes him up on this high mountain, and he has him look out at all the people of Israel sent them, but they can't even see them all. There's so many. They're on this high mountain. They can only see the outskirts of the camp because there are just so many people of Israel. And he builds 7 altars, and he makes 7 sacrifices and says, okay, Balaam, now I want you to go up here and I want you to curse these people. This is what he says in verse 8. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed? And how shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? And then he goes on and he blesses the people of Israel instead of cursing them. And in verse 11 and 12, Balak says to Balaam, what have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, and look, you have blessed them bountifully. And then Balaam says, must I not heed and speak what the Lord has put in my mouth? So Balaam said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm doing what I told you I was going to do. I can only say what God told me to say. And I'm sure he's thinking about that angel. That's all I'm going to say. And so Balak just won't give up, and he really wants this curse. And so he takes them to a second place. He builds 7 more altars, and he makes 7 more sacrifices. And again, they can see so many people out there. And in verse 19, Balaam gets up there again, and he's supposed to curse the people of Israel, but instead a blessing comes out of his mouth. And I love what he says in verse 19, 20. As a matter of fact, we use this, we quote this verse a lot today, and you probably didn't realize it came out of the mouth of Balaam. Verse 19 says, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do? Or has he spoken, and he will not make it good? Behold, I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot reverse it. Out of Balaam's mouth comes the character of God. I love that. He says that God is a God of truth, that he does not lie. He's not going to lie. And that he is also immutable. He's unchangeable. He's not going to change his mind about his blessing. And that his will is going to happen. If he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. And if he makes a promise, he's going to keep it. He talks about the character of God. And then he blesses the people again. And I love verse 25. Balak says to Balaam, neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all. Balak says, shut up, man, shut up. Just if you can't curse them, don't say anything. Just don't say anything, man. Just stop it. Stop it. You're making everything worse. But Balak doesn't give up. He takes him to a third place. And in this third time, he puts up 7 altars and makes 7 sacrifices. And he wants Balak to once again curse his people. Balak is not learning at all. He is more stubborn than that donkey about wanting this curse from Balaam. And he wants Balaam to do it. And Balaam is not doing it. Here we are in Numbers 24 now. Now, when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as the other times to seek to use sorcery, but he set his face to the wilderness. And Balaam raised his eyes and saw Israel encamped according to their tribes. And get this, and the Spirit of God came on him. We see many beautiful things here that pour out of his mouth when the Spirit of God comes upon him. I think it shows God's great love for the people of Israel in spite of all that they have done. God is a God of love. And it talks about how beautiful their tents are, how beautiful the people of Jacob are going to be. I think he sees their great potential there. And we hear the heart of God about the people of Israel in that moment. This time Balak says, forget it. I'm not giving you any reward. Look in verse 11. Now therefore flee to your place. I said I would greatly honor you, but in fact the Lord has kept you back from honor. So he's like, I'm not going to give you anything. So now Balaam learns that he's not going to get any of the money. He's not going to get any of the riches. He's not going to get any of the accolades and honor that Balak was going to give him. And Balak was a powerful man. So look at what Balaam says in verse 14. And now indeed, I'm going to my people. Come with me, Balak. I will advise you what this people will do to your people in the latter days. He's like, Balak, come with me and I will advise you. I know what's about to happen. Why don't you come with me and I'm going to advise you. And we'll see later, Balaam had his eyes on the prize and the honor that he was going to get from Balak. He couldn't stop from blessing this people because the Spirit of the Lord came on him to do so, and he knew about that angel, and so he did not curse this people. He knew better than to do that, but he still has his eyes on that. He still has this pride and this greed issue, and he's like, come with me, Balak, and I'm going to advise you. Let me stop here for a second, and let's just talk about the lesson we've learned from Balaam and Balak already. Abraham Lincoln was asked once if he thought the Lord was on his side when speaking about the Civil War, the North versus the South. And Abraham Lincoln had a great response. He said, I hope that we are on God's side. And that's a better place to be. It's better, instead of having God on your side, it's better to be on God's side. And it's certainly better than being against God and going against God. And this was a hard lesson for Balaam to learn. And if we've learned something from Balaam, and even something we've learned from Moses, two leaders here in the last couple of chapters, is that when God tells you to do something, do it exactly as he said do it, and do it with the attitude that he wants you to have. Anyone can be used by God to be a leader. Don't get hung up on the fact that God is using you to be a leader or to minister to different people in a certain way. Don't get caught up and get full of pride because you're being used by God. Keep in mind, God can use the dog next door if he wants to. I mean, he used the donkey and he used Balaam. He can use anybody to accomplish his task. God can use anything to accomplish his task and his will. So when he chooses to use us, when he chooses to use me and chooses to use you, that's an honor. And we need to take that honor with humility and gratitude and serve with all of our might, with all of our heart. Because he could have used anybody. He could have used anything. But he chooses to use us. And so that's a great thing. And that's one thing we've got to learn from this. That it is an honor. And we want to be on God's side. All right, so what have we learned so far? We learned first that God puts leaders over us. And we need to respect them. Leaders, we've learned as leaders to give God credit and to lead with humility and reverence for the Lord. And then we've also learned from Balaam that it's better to be on God's side of an issue. And if God blesses it, you want to be a part of that. If God curses it, you don't want to be a part of that. Love what God loves. Hate what God hates. Well, that brings us to chapter 25, which brings us Balaam's legacy. In chapter 25, verse 1 through 3, we see that the Israelites began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. And in verse 2 it says, they invited the people to sacrifice to their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord roused against Israel. Baal, B-A-A-L. Baal comes into the picture. Baal is a false god of fertility and of plenty, of harvest, that is going to be a problem for the rest of the time the Israelites are a nation. Before they go into exile, they're going to have to deal with Baal all this time. And now they're introduced to Baal by the Moabite and the Midianite people who have come together, and they are enticing the men to come have sex and with these ladies, these prostitutes of Baal. That's how they worship Baal, with these prostitutes. They would do this, and they're eating this meat or eating things that have been sacrificed to Baal, and they're bowing down to worship Baal. So God considers this adultery against him. And this anger burns against them. And he tells Moses in verse 4 to take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from them. And so they're judged for worshiping Baal. And that's terrible. Then we see a crazy thing that happened, that in front of all the people of Israel, this one Israelite takes this Midianite woman, after he's just found out that everybody's going to be judged for doing this and executed. He takes this woman right in front of the head priest at the time, Eleazar, and Moses, and he takes her into his tent to have sex with her, right in front of everybody. And verse 7 says, now when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And get this, he went in after the man of Israel into the tent. He went into the tent, and they're right there in front of him, having sex right there in front of them. And he thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman, through her body. He took a javelin and he stabbed it through both of them, killing them both. And when he did that, God stopped the plague that he was hitting the people of Israel with for their idolatry and their adultery. I mean, that's right out of some kind of movie, isn't it? He just took a spear and he thrust it through. Sorry, I got PG-13 there for a minute. but that really happened. And Phinehas was rewarded because he was zealous for the Lord. His anger burned, a righteous indignation that he had against this Israelite that would have the gall to do this right when all the people of Israel were being judged for it. His desire and lust for this woman outweighed the needs of all the people. And he took a javelin and he went there and he executed them both at the same time in a dramatic way. Here's the crazy thing, and that's why I call this Balaam's legacy. We find out later in Numbers that it was Balaam's advice to Balak that they do this, that they weren't going to defeat them in a military battle. And since they couldn't defeat them in a military battle, defeat them spiritually, get God against them. And he could defeat them by enticing them away from the Lord their God and to Baal of Peor. That was Balaam's legacy. Balaam did that. Balaam did that to get the money and the riches that he didn't get because he didn't curse them. So he gave them bad advice. And that is talked about throughout the rest of the Bible. That's talked about in 2 Peter, it's talked about in Revelation. It's talked about the greed of Balaam and how he gave bad advice. And it's talked about at the end of Numbers by Moses. And we see in the end of Numbers that Moses, when they went against the Midianites and Moab, that they defeated them, killed 5 kings, and they made a special point to let you know that they also killed Balaam, the prophet, who had given the bad advice for the children of Israel to be enticed to worship Baal. And what were our lessons today? God's put leaders over us. Leaders, we need to give God credit and serve with humility. All of us need to be on God's side. Love what he loves, hate what he hates, and be zealous, more than just love, be passionate about the Lord, about his word, and about what he's done for us. So that's the book of Numbers. I hope you enjoyed our study so far. Next week we're going to be getting into the book of Deuteronomy. Literally, we are only spending 1 week in the book of Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy kind of sums up a lot of the stuff we've already went through and all the things that have happened in the first 4 books of the Bible and happened to the people of Israel. And so we're going to be looking at the last part of the book of Deuteronomy. So if you read the last 4 or 5 chapters, starting in chapter 28, read to the end, you'll be ready for next week. And I look forward to having you there. God bless you. Have a great night.